Hello again, everybody. This is kind of another follow-up video that I wanted to do. My video series so far has kind of been on physical models, things that we can look at in our everyday lives to better understand our spiritual life. I wanted to take a minute to do a video that's going to kind of explain why I'm doing the other videos, how it all makes sense, even kind of touches a little bit on biblical symbology, actually, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. We live in if you're not familiar with the word prose in writing and literature, we live in sort of a story-oriented time and society. Movies, television, books, they tend to be stories. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that it's not poetry. Uh, we are used to having the story laid out for us in such a way that the characters, their actions show who they are, the story reveals about the characters. It's that sort of thing. Uh, Poetry, on the other hand, is much different. The reason that I bring up poetry is because in the original languages that the Bible was written in, a lot of it was poetry. It was, it's kind of interesting to think that the Bible that we read in English, for example, is not very poetic a lot of the time, and especially with a lot of the new translations and the way they do it, using a dynamic translation process. If you're not familiar with that, I recommend looking that up. Um, but a lot of the poetry gets lost. It would be very similar to translating Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe, for example, into another language, in which none of the elements of their poetry comes through. And what you're getting is a story where it was originally a poem. Yes, it might be interesting, but it's not going to be as interesting. It's not going to be as beautiful by any means. And that's kind of what we have in a certain regard with the Bible. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, if you've ever studied poetry or if you like poetry, you understand that poetry has to say in a very short space what a story might take much, much, much longer to say. Hence why poetry uses a lot of symbolism and it uses a lot of other literary devices to communicate things that are very, very large in a very, very small space. Now, with that understanding, the fact that the Bible uses poetry makes a lot of sense because you're trying to communicate attributes and you're trying to communicate things about an invisible God who is very, very large, we'll say. So you're trying to communicate largeness in a very compact space. I can only think that if God was written out as a story, uh, I can't imagine how big that book would be, considering that the Bible is already pretty big. Okay, so again, how does this matter? Well, if you've watched my other two videos on exercising and how that relates to spiritual things and plants and spiritual things, um, kind of what I've done in those videos is I've looked at plants and exercising as a symbol. I've looked at them as a symbol that represents a deeper, broader, uh, bigger spiritual model. So by understanding the small things, it helps to understand the big things. Um, Now this is useful because with living in a story culture, we're not used to, say, looking at an object and considering all the different aspects of that object. As a poet, I would sit and look at something and I would observe it, and I would observe not just the obvious outward things of that object, say the color, the shape, different things like that. While those are useful things, um, examining the deeper qualities of things can help you to better understand what it's a symbol for, or what the symbol means in a much fuller way. It's sort of akin to if you've ever studied a foreign language, especially one that's very far removed from English, and you have one English word uh, that's translated from another language, and then you look that word up in the original, and you look at all the different possible translations for that word. You start to see that it's sort of like looking at the trunk of a tree and then going and looking at all of its branches and leaves and twigs and different things like that. Well, a symbol's kind of the same way. The symbol is sort of like the trunk of the tree. It's the most, it's the sort of the biggest, meatiest part of what you're looking at. And then if you take time to look at all the different branches and leaves and twigs and different things like that, you gain a fuller picture of this tree. It can be the same way with symbols and metaphors and all these different things. One of the things that I really liked about, or I really like about Greek philosophers, for example, is they took a lot of time to think about things. If you look at the way that they did science, for example, a lot of it was thought experiments. It was thinking. It wasn't our current model of experimentation where you put together some sort of testable experiment. They would just sit around and think it through, which is really cool when you think about it. And philosophy, by the way, it comes from Greek words meaning love of wisdom, philosophia. So that's kind of interesting as well, because the Bible talks a lot about wisdom and how we should really be interested in wisdom. But anyways, so these Greek philosophers, actually, a lot of the time, if you've ever studied philosophy and physics, you know that a lot of these philosophers, I mean, they may have not been dead on with their answers to physics questions, but they got really close a lot of the time. And for, being however long ago that these guys were sitting around just thinking about this stuff, that's really quite phenomenal work. But the point in all that is they sat around and they thought about things. Our culture is very loud and very noisy. We don't often take time to just sit and think, quiet. My point here is take time, pick something out. If you're a parent, oh man, you probably already do it, but sit and just watch your kids and observe how a kid acts, and then think about what the Bible says about how we're God's children. And then you can take that a step further and think about yourself as a parent, and how do you react to your child when they do something wrong? How do you react when they do something right? And put that in the context of what the Bible says about God as our Father, for example. Start to make these comparisons and these connections, and I think you'll find it immensely useful. Anyways, I just wanted to do a brief, really, that's a super brief overview on sort of symbology and thinking about things. But I highly recommend it. It's a great exercise, and I think you could really gain a lot from it. Thanks for watching.